My father left me when I was just a kid, but now I learned why.
A mother's choice haunts two men for their entire lives. Even the like button refused to be this cold. You've been warned.
I came here to share my story as a way to clear my mind and to possibly help others. My mother and the man I knew as my dad, who I'll be calling Phil, met when they were 18. According to my mother, they immediately fell in love. After a few months of dating, Mom found out she was pregnant, and she and Phil moved in together at a home owned by my grandparents. That home is located just down the block from where my grandparents live, and is where my mom still resides today. Being they were both so young, their families thought it best they not get married right away, and instead live together for a while, to see how they got along. At the time, my mother was working at the mall, and my dad had a job delivering appliances. Even though they were both young and struggling, everyone who knew them thought them to be mature and grounded for their age. They both worked hard and were very good parents. My dad eventually obtained his commercial driver's license and got a better job driving truck for a farming company in our area. While working there, he saved up enough money to put a down payment on his own truck and became an independent driver when I was 4. He did this to provide a better life for us and for the freedom it provided. The only drawback was, he often spent 4 to 5 days away at a time, and when he was gone, I really missed my dad. I hated when he left, as I always worried he wouldn't come back. Little did I know, one day, that would happen. To ease my mind, Dad bought me a road atlas and would map his route to show where he was going and when he'd be back. He'd also call every night from the road to tell me where he was. While talking, I'd locate the spot on the map, then calculate how many days it would be until he'd return. When he did come back, he'd always bring me something from the road. Normally, it was a small souvenir or a unique candy or food item he found at a truck stop. But to me, it was like gold, and I always looked forward to it. Phil and I were as close as a father and son could be. He was a giant of a man, my hero dad, and I wanted to be just like him when I grew up. He and my mother also had a very close and loving relationship, and I distinctly remember them openly showing affection for each other when we were all a family. According to my grandparents, everyone thought of them as a perfect young couple. Phil was also very close to my grandparents, and they viewed him like a son. The 5 of us ate dinner together nearly every night when he was home, and attend church on Sunday mornings. The situation was ideal for me, growing up in a home with 2 loving parents, with my grandparents just down the street. My life was as good as it possibly could be, until about a month after my 6th birthday. That's when I started experiencing some health issues. My pediatrician ordered a bunch of tests, but everything came back fine. After doing all he knew to do, he sent me to a specialist, who eventually identified what was ailing me. Thankfully, it wasn't anything chronic or life-threatening, and it was resolved with medication. However, the experience was something that would forever change our lives. While I was being put through those tests, the doctor ordered tests that required samples from both my mother and father. Through those tests, it was revealed that my dad, Phil, was not my biological father. Since I was so young and sick at the time, no one shared this with me, and I actually wasn't made aware of this until 5 years later. As such, I had absolutely no idea what was going on behind the scenes in our house. Thinking back now, I do remember everyone acting a little different, but nothing really stood out at the time. During my treatment and for the days following my recovery, Phil took time off and spent almost all of it with me. It was summer, and when I started feeling better, he either took me to the pool or fishing almost every day. He also bought me a new bike I'd been wanting, and we'd go out to lunch 3 to 4 times a week. Looking back now, those were probably the happiest days of my childhood. Little did I know, it would all soon come to a bitter end. The last time I saw Phil was on a Tuesday late in the summer of 2005, which happened to be my first day of school in the 1st grade. He woke me in the middle of the night and told me he was leaving for a trip. He normally left at night, so this wasn't out of the ordinary. However, this time he said something different. He told me he'd be gone for a while and wanted me to be strong and take care of my mom and grandparents. He asked if I could do that for him, and I told him I would. I remember telling him I would, so proudly. I also remember his eyes being red and bloodshot, but thought it was just from being so early. Before he left, he gave me a really tight hug and told me he loved me. When he pulled away in his truck, he stopped in front of the house, rolled down his window and waved to me, then blew his horn 3 times. This was the secret signal we had for when he was leaving or returning. Later that day, I went to school and couldn't wait to tell Phil about it when he called that night. When I got home, my mom was there and she told me she talked to Phil and he wasn't going to be able to call tonight because he was busy. I suspected something right away, as he had never done that. I asked my mom what he was doing and she told me he was going to be very busy with work. I remember being really disappointed by this, but thought, all right, I'll talk to him tomorrow. This happened again the following night and my worries grew. I sensed my mother was hiding something from me. I asked her if something was wrong and she told me, no, everything was fine. She would say,
"Hey, don't worry about Dad now. He's just busy. Working."
The day after that, when I got home from school, there was a big package waiting for me. It was an exact model of Phil's truck that he bought and shipped to me overnight. I remember being so excited and relieved and spent the rest of the afternoon playing with that truck. I couldn't wait for Phil to call so I could thank him and ask him when he was coming home. That never happened, and instead, later that evening, my world was shattered. While I was playing, my mom and grandparents came into my room to talk to me. It was then my grandpa told me Phil would not be coming back. This was the first time everyone stopped referring to him as my dad, and now they called him by his name, Phil. It was strange to me. I didn't understand at first and looked over at my mother for an explanation. She and my grandma were crying, and I wasn't sure what was going on. My grandpa told me my mom and Phil had some differences they couldn't work out, and Phil had decided to leave. I thought they were all lying and believed something bad happened to Phil, as I knew he'd never do that. I started screaming at them to tell me the truth and to take me to Phil. I told them I wanted to see my dad and wanted Grandpa to drive me to him. I was inconsolable, and by this point everyone was crying. It was awful, the worst day of my life. My grandpa assured me Phil was fine, but he again told me he would not be returning home. When this finally sunk in, I was crushed, devastated, and every other similar word you can think of. I suffered extreme emotional stress, which was so severe I was kept out of school for 3 full weeks. I probably should have been taken to a counselor, but instead my family tried soothing my sorrow with love and attention, which didn't work. I blamed them for Phil leaving and was very withdrawn emotionally from everyone. All I could think about was Dad. I constantly wondered where he was and what he was doing. Every time someone got a call, I thought it was him. Every truck I saw, I pictured Phil driving it, and every time I'd hear a truck's horn, I thought it was him coming home, but he never did. I couldn't understand why he left, and because I didn't know why, I started blaming myself. I lived with this terrible guilt for years, until my mom eventually told me when I was 11. It was a shock, and I initially felt deep resentment towards my mother. I was even angry with my grandparents for keeping this from me. My birth father is some guy my mother worked with at the mall. My grandparents didn't even know she was dating him. According to my mother, they became friends and would sometimes go out to eat after closing. She said they only dated a short time as she viewed him as just a friend. She said once she met Phil, she ended their relationship as she knew Phil was the one. My birth father doesn't know I'm his son, and I plan to keep it that way. I asked my mother not to inform him, as I wasn't interested in meeting him. She was relieved to hear this, as she didn't want him in our lives, even though he's apparently a decent guy. He still lives in the area with his family, and works as the parts department manager for a car dealership. While my mother was the root cause of everything, I couldn't stay mad at her for long, as she has always been a great mother who devoted her entire life to raising me right. The same for my grandparents. Even though I eventually accepted things and went on with life, Phil, my dad, never completely left my mind. For years, I'd think of him all the time, especially when I saw a kid out somewhere with his dad. I'd constantly have flashbacks, and it really messed me up. When I got into middle school and started playing sports, I'd daydream one day Phil would be sitting up in the stands, watching me. Whenever a game got tough, I would fantasize about him standing there, and it would energize me to give it all I had. I used to scan the crowd, hoping to actually spot him. But of course, he wasn't there. Though I seemed like a happy-go-lucky kid on the outside, inside I struggled with a deep sadness that never really went away until I met the woman who is now my wife. Like my mother and Phil, we met and fell in love when we were young. When I say I fell, I mean I fell hard, and my wife did too. We got married a few years later when we were both 21. We now have a 17-month-old son and a daughter on the way. Like me, my wife comes from a broken home and her dad was mostly out of the picture. Because of this, we have a special bond and have committed to never let this happen to our family. I thank God multiple times a day for bringing my wife and son into my life. Since meeting her, I'm a new person, and my life is full of joy and hope. I no longer spend time thinking about the past and all the sadness, and instead think mostly about my growing family in the future. I work hard to provide a good life for them and do my best to spend as much quality time with my wife and baby as I possibly can. A couple weeks ago, something happened that brought all the pain and anguish of my childhood rushing back into focus. After finishing dinner one evening, I received a call from a woman who identified herself as Phil's wife. I was frozen silent when I heard those words. She told me Phil had been battling cancer and was back in the hospital now and wasn't doing well. I didn't have a response as I was speechless and wondered why she was calling to tell me this. After all, it had been nearly 18 years since Phil left, and it took me nearly 14 years to get over him. When I asked her, she said she debated long and hard about whether she should call me or not. She said I didn't owe Phil anything, but she wanted me to know he never forgot me and still talked about me often. Those words were a surprise, and they took my breath away. He told her leaving me was the biggest regret of his life and wished he had worked something out where he could have stayed in touch with me. He told her he was pressured by his family to leave, and his lawyer advised him he needed to cut all ties or risk being financially responsible for another man's child. I again asked her why she felt it necessary to call me about this. She said Phil wrote me a letter a few years ago, and he planned to mail it to me, but never did. He kept the letter in his truck, sealed and stamped, but just couldn't bring himself to send it. She then said, Phil doesn't know she contacted me, but she felt I'd want to know what went on and how he really felt about me. She said he really loved me and never stopped missing me. After talking to her for a few minutes, I ended up giving her my address so she could send me the letter. She thanked me for being gracious, and we ended our call. After I hung up, the weight of what she told me hit me and I broke down. Momentarily, I was thrown back to the dark days of my childhood. It really messed me up, and if not for my wife, I'm not sure how I'd handle it. When the letter came, I couldn't bring myself to open it, and instead had my wife open it and read it to me. Summarizing his words, Phil said he was very sorry for leaving, like he did. He said it was the worst mistake of his life, and he's thought about me almost every day since he left. He said he had a wife and 2 daughters now, and was happy, but still has a gaping hole in his heart that I still occupy. He continued on saying more things like that, and by the end of the letter, both my wife and I were sobbing. I felt a rush of emotion, mostly sadness and grief, mixed with some anger towards this man. After I calmed down, I started thinking about what I'd do if this happened to me at my age. I'd like to think I'd stay, as I couldn't imagine giving up my child, but I guess you don't know what you'll do until you face something like that. Over the next week, I threw myself into work and kept myself busy at home to keep my mind off things. My wife sensed I was thinking about it a lot, even though I said I was fine. One night after work, she told me she did some research and learned that Phil and his family live just a few hours from us. She then asked if I'd like to go see him. She said if I did, she'd come with me as she'd like to meet him. She even suggested we could go that Saturday and come back on Sunday, but only if I wanted. I told her I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, as I was concerned about reopening old wounds. My wife told me she understood, but wanted me to know she would be by my side to support me in whatever I chose to do. That's just her. She's a very caring person who's always looking out for others. After thinking about it for the next week, I decided I was going to see Phil. I knew it would be difficult, but I had to do it for my own peace of mind. When I got home that evening, I told my wife, and we discussed going that Saturday. After finishing dinner, I called Phil's wife to see if that would be okay with her. She answered and we said our hellos. After that, I told her I'd thought about it and decided I'd like to come and see Phil. She was quiet on the other end, and I heard her clearing her throat. She then spoke in a low tone, saying she was sorry to have to tell me this. But Phil passed away Sunday afternoon at 1:03 p.m. Hearing those words devastated me, even though I'd not seen this man for almost 18 years. I couldn't keep it together and started crying. I told her I was sorry and apologized for not coming to see him. Right after she called, she interrupted me and said I had nothing to be sorry about and that Phil would not want me to feel bad. She said the day after she spoke to me, Phil's health took a turn for the worse and he was going in and out of consciousness. She said during one of his lucid times, she told Phil she had spoken to me and that I had accepted his letter. She said hearing that, Phil smiled and squeezed her hand, so he was aware we had connected before he passed away. She said a few hours after that, Phil fell into a coma and never awakened, and he passed on Sunday surrounded by his family. Even though it probably shouldn't have, Phil's passing impacted me like he had never left. Like he was still my father, my real dad. In my mind, the way I wanted things to work out is that I would visit Phil at the hospital. He would recover, and then he and I could become good friends. I believe I have to accept this reality, in which our Creator had other plans for him and me. I do feel relieved knowing his wife told him she talked to me and that I accepted his letter. I just hope he knew I still loved him and forgave him for leaving. He was a good man, and I believe he is now among the angels. A few weeks ago, I, along with my very pregnant wife and son, traveled over to visit Phil's grave. We met up with Phil's wife at the cemetery, and she led us over to his final resting place. It was very emotional for me, and for all of us, actually. There was no gravestone yet, just a marker, along with freshly laid soil covered by a mound of decaying flowers. I was able to keep it together, until saw a large ribbon across one of the bouquets. It was from Phil's daughters, and it read,
"Beep, beep, beep. We love you, Dad."
Reading those words just destroyed me and I lost it, as that was our secret signal. After we left the cemetery, we went to a nearby restaurant and spent a couple hours talking with Phil's wife. We shared a lot of stories and she and my wife have since become friends over socials. After we got back, my wife and I told my mom about Phil's passing and everything that happened since. That was tough as Mom has never gotten over Phil and still deeply regrets what happened all those years ago. Mom still carries enormous guilt for the decision she made and everything that came of it. While she never cheated on Phil, she admits she was certain I wasn't his child. When she discovered she was pregnant, she was scared and afraid of losing Phil, so she told him the child, me, was his. My entire family is totally opposed to not keeping the baby, so thankfully for me, that wasn't even a consideration. As I said before, I don't harbor any resentment towards my mom, as I know she's a great person. I hope one day she comes to terms with things and can forgive herself for what happened. As for me, things didn't turn out like I wanted, but at least my mind is finally at peace, and I know Phil is in a better place now. One day, hopefully many, many years from now, I look forward to meeting up with him in that better place.
Royal A.I.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I began sweating from the moment his wife called you. It's just, Don't judge me, but I understand your mother as I would have done the same thing. It's sad, but for those women suffering from keeping a lie like this, I'm just happy DNA testing isn't mandatory at birth. Even more happy that pregnancies aren't questioned and heavily scrutinized when they are from the beginning of new relationships. I could never risk my husband knowing the truth and abandoning our family. Don't get me wrong, I never lied about my kids to my husband. I'm so glad I never had to lie. I just get it. That's all.
Madam, please feel ashamed for what you just shared with us, even though it's anonymous. There's nothing good nor brave in sharing. You would lie to your husband and child. Feeling emotional because of this story doesn't take away the big lesson in it. Read it again, then delete your comment before you infect others with your toxic mindset. Learn from the horrible aftermath, and then, and only then, share why you would never even think about lying about something like paternity. It's the darkest and most feared form of betrayal for a reason.
OP, your story proves it's best to tell the truth from the start because a cover-up will destroy lives, literally. Your whole childhood got messed up because your mother chose to be selfish. In my culture, this doesn't happen very often, as we marry only if all parents involved give the green light. I know it's not a positive thing for Western people, but compared to casually having a baby with someone who is, according to your mother, just a friend?
That's a tough story. Thanks for sharing, OP. I was scared when you introduced your lady. It almost made me think you were about to tell us that your wife was having an affair. Or worse, your first kid wasn't yours, and you would relive the life of Phil. Imagine the horror. Truly wish you the best.
You can't abandon a fake family any more than you can mend illusions. The husband and the kid are the true victims and deserve our condolences. Who believes his mother didn't cheat? Also, the fact that he believes her still shows. He is deeply blue-pilled. OP's mom, well, she's a monster. She knew, like all the women in paternity fraud cases, who the real father was, but still tricked an unsuspecting man into raising the kid. The mother scarred Phil for life with that betrayal, as well as damaged her own son.
What would you advise OP? Let us know in the comments. You like the way these stories are brought to you? If so, I got you covered. More like this on my channel. Thank you for staying till the end. Let me know if you enjoyed this episode. See you in the next one.